Hello and welcome to the EDHRECast, where we're all about Commander, data, and dad jokes. I'm Joey Schultz and I'm joined by my fantastic co-host. He puts the win in lore win. It's Dana Roach. Hey, buddy.
Matt actually just texted me. He wants to borrow a pair of my wool socks for his wedding. I'm guessing he's afraid of getting cold feet. But I mean, I'll help him out.
Don't put that thought into the universe, Dana.
I am excited for the wedding. Unlike my old iPhone, I hope it has great reception.
Goodness. Yes, for folks wondering, Matt is actually, by the time this episode goes out, he'll have just gotten married. So send some congratulations to him. That's a really great thing. And Dana, I can't wait to see you at that reception. I'm sure it will be received very, very well, or whatever joke
and might actually have to record a EDH Rec on the Road episode there from hotel. We will see.
Dressed up all spiffy. I love it. I love the sound of that. Well, Dana, it is the two of us right now. Yeah. And we've got quite a juicy topic because over the last week, we saw some updates to the brackets and the game changers and stuff like that. Yeah. And I mean, we got to talk about it, dude. But more importantly than that, we got to talk about what these changes and what the bracket system so far has revealed about the Commander format and about Commander players.
Yeah. I mean, I think these changes were bigger than we were probably anticipating. But they're in line with what we've seen so far, and I think the Commander Committee has a specific feeling about how the community handles themselves with these cards, and I think they're continuing to unban cards with that in mind. So I'm curious what you think about the trend, not just these changes, but the overall trends and changes we've seen in the last year since the brackets have gone live.
Yeah, so we'll get some folks up to date with what the changes were. There were a couple of cards that were removed from the Game Changers list. There's also been some updated language and a new image of what the bracket system will look like to provide potentially some extra clarity there. We'll go over some reactions to it. And at the end, try and discuss what all of this sort of points to as a potential future direction for the format, or what it has revealed about how players have engaged with the game so far, and what maybe attitudes are shifting within players, and sort of all that stuff that we can expect. But to just get started and make sure that we all are on the same page here, let's start with the big news, I think, are the cards that were removed from the Game Changers list, because there were quite a few. Yeah,
10 total cards, I believe. And they had them kind of clustered into two groups and two leftovers, I guess. The first group that they just refer to as big mana cards. So we have Expropriate, Jin-Gitaxias Core Augur, Vorinclex, and Sway of Stars. So they're all cards that are a lot of mana to cast and get into play. And even though they have pretty large footprints in terms of like what they do to the game, they're also cards that are coming down for the most part at a point in the game when like you expect cards to, be game changing.
That's what they say. That said, you were very swift to point out no one hard casts the Jin-Gitaxias. That's right. We reanimate that thing into play on turn 3 and stuff like that. So there is a little bit of that. I don't know if discrepancy is the word, but that is a thing that we are aware of. It's just like, well, who casts some of these? Honestly, though, it's like a quick thing to point out about at least a few of them.
Yeah. Then we had a list of 4 legends, and yes, Jin-Gitaxias and Vorinclex are legends, but like for the most part, they aren't showing up in the command zone. These next 4 are ones that are most frequently seen in the command zone. So you have Winota, Joiner of Forces, Yuriko, Tiger's Shadow, Urza, Lord High Artificer, and Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy.
And to briefly stay on this one, the logic here does make sense to me in terms of we cannot regulate every single OP commander that can come out, and there are a lot of OP commanders that are coming out. So having a whole section on the Game Changers list that is devoted to really powerful legends does sort of feel like that could be an ever-growing area, and the list just continues to swell and to swell. If we were to always have room on the Game Changers list for things that are strong in the command zone, that's the type of thing that we constantly feel that you have to update. So instead, it seems like they are moving it more towards players to recognize something that's in the command zone across the table from them and have that be part of the pregame discussion to see whether or not that's a game that they are interested in or not, rather than feeling as though those legends must be regulated by this list.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point. I hadn't thought of it until you first brought it up when we were talking about this. But yeah, like you could add 2 or 3 commanders to this cluster of Winota, Yuriko, Kinnan, Urza, power level commanders every single year, which is a pretty big ask. Or you can just like trust folks to look at them and be like, I'm just not interested in playing that. We're playing bracket 2 and you've got a Yuriko deck. I'm just not interested in playing that. Because like the alternative, like we mentioned, is just keep making this list larger or letting folks just choose to opt out when they see that in the command zone. And I understand why they've chosen the let folks opt out route, because like that's just the path of least resistance pretty clearly.
Yeah, it does feel like it puts a little bit more onus on players, but at the same time,
Sure.
it also does put players back in the driver's seat from one perspective as well. So, more freedom also means a little bit more responsibility here for the players being a bigger part of those conversations when it comes to the legend and the command zone specifically. And then the last two that were also removed from the game changer list are food chain and deflecting SWAT. Food chain makes a lot of sense to us. I think we're even surprised to see it on the list in the first place because it is a very well-known combo engine, particularly when you use its ability to create mana with Prosh, for instance. It's the kind of thing that can go super infinite super quickly. But given that its most common usage is as a combo engine and combos are already regulated by their spaces within the brackets, it kind of felt like, that can actually come off. It doesn't need to be specifically named here. So that would be the reasoning for food chain, whereas deflecting SWAT, well, that one I think we maybe disagree with its removal, but I think a lot of people will have voiced that opinion by now.
Yeah, so the exception, the thing that's strange about deflecting SWAT is I look at, and I guess I can only speak from my point of view, but I look at these cards and none of them make me say, oh, well, now I can run this. I wasn't running it before, but like now it's okay in bracket 2, or now it doesn't count as a game changer for bracket 3. I'm jamming that into my decks. That's not how I feel about any of these, except deflecting SWAT. Like that's one where I'm like, oh, that's just a really useful card to have in a lot of decks, and maybe I wasn't running it before, but I would strongly consider it now. That said, when we streamed after these changes came out, Matt made a really good point. Like, well, maybe Red is allowed to have a couple of these like borderline problematic cards that are allowed to be legal because, every card gets to have some strong stuff, and I kind of buy that. This is maybe Red's version of that. So I guess in hindsight, the way, or like having had him point that out, I actually kind of like that logic.
The thing that they note in the article here is that for deflecting SWAT, while free spells are powerful, they say that it's a notch below the free counter magic like Force of Will and Fierce Guardianship. It only hit specific kinds of cards and didn't quite fit the description of a game changer. I personally don't know that I feel the same way. I think in some perspectives, deflecting SWAT can even be considered a little bit of card advantage because you're taking someone else's spell and you're making it yours. And there are a lot of very defensive ways to use it. But at the same time, it's not the kind of thing that I'm going to feel like too activated about necessarily, but it is the type of thing that I disagree with. It's the kind of thing that I personally probably would have kept on the list. Now, I just want to throw in here real quick. I did a video a short time ago when they added more game changers to the list, whether it maybe went too far. And I used some data about players self-reporting where their deck lands, and also the data of how many game changers actually appear in decks. Check that video out. It's a fantastic time. An interesting observation that I discovered in the course of making that video, though, was seeing that with the game changers that they added to the list, that actually made the distribution of how many game changers appear in decks and where players are reporting their decks lined up a little bit better than it had previously when the game changers list was only about 40 cards. Now that some cards have been removed, I'm very excited to pull that data again. This is a very recent announcement, so I don't have that data just yet, but I'm really excited to revisit that. And I'm kind of curious whether these changes will throw those graphs all out of whack. I'm personally hoping that they don't, but it will be very interesting to see.
Yeah, getting some of a breakdown on some of that stuff will be interesting.
So yeah, keep your eye on the channel for a future update about that, because I think will be very helpful to contextualize how players end up responding to these changes as time goes on.
Yeah.
But going back to each of these cards individually, I want to ask you, Dana, if there are any of these cards that were removed that real quick you want to say that you would have been like, I'd keep this, or these felt super right to me to take off. Are there any changes here of what we just mentioned where you're just like, whoa, red alert? Or how are you feeling about these changes just right off the start?
The only one that jumps out is probably Urza, Lord High Artificer.
Yeah.
Both because of how the card works and because it's monocolor. It is much more likely to show up in a deck versus as the commander of a deck. Not that you couldn't run Winota in, some Boros deck in the 99. I'm sure that definitely does happen. But Urza is much more likely to show up being super strong in the 99 in a way you weren't ready for than the rest of these. So, that's the one that maybe I would raise my eyebrows at. Versus Winota, Yuriko, Kinnan are almost always going to be in the command zone, and you can just choose to not participate if you're not in the mood for that.
Yeah.
How about yourself?
I'm a little divided on Urza personally. I think it is still very strong in the 99, but I do agree that it is certainly strongest in the command zone. So I'm going back and forth on it personally. Deflecting SWAT is the kind of thing I would have kept on the list as well. And then for the high mana value section that we covered right off the bat, Sway of the Stars, don't care about that. That one does not need to be a game changer. We could have seen it go from unbanned and bypass the game changer list entirely. I'm happy for it to be removed. Vorinclex feels like it could potentially fall under the description of MLD or mass land denial stuff that gets covered by the bracket system already, if people feel that way. Those don't matter to me. The only high mana cards where I don't feel the logic holds exactly the same is Jin-Gitaxias and Expropriate. I do like the signal flares that these give off about a deck's intentions, and their high mana costs feel to me like a little bit of a smokescreen because of the ways that these cards are actually deployed and abused. I think those are the ones that have me holding my breath just a little bit, because like, I don't know, I look at Jin-Gitaxias and then I look at the things that stayed on the game changer list. The fact that Consecrated Sphinx remained on the list but Jin-Gitaxias was removed feels like I might have made the opposite choice there. It feels like if one was going to go, I would have removed both of them, or if one is going to stay, I would have kept both of them. So that's one that has me scratching my head a little bit, I think.
The one note I will make, because the point you made about how it's Jin-Gitaxias is almost always entombed and reanimated when it comes into play is definitely true, and that's not going to change. However, there's a lot of things that are like really busted to entomb and reanimate too. Is this slightly better than most of them? Probably, but like, if someone was wanting to do that kind of thing and entomb and then reanimate something super, super powerful, there's plenty of things they could do that with right now. And this is just one more weapon in the arsenal. And if people weren't already doing that in your play group, they're not going to probably start doing it because of this. So while it's strong, and that's a really strong play, it's not the kind of really strong play that I think people are going to begin seeing in environments where they weren't already seeing that kind of play. Similar, that's how Food Chain kind of works, right? Like,
sure. Yeah.
You
honestly,
probably weren't you're not going to start seeing Food Chain in places where it wasn't appropriate. I'm going to guess that's going to be true of Jin-Gitaxias as well.
Totally fair. I think for the most part, I look at some of these. Honestly, I feel this way a little bit about Expropriate too. I look at some of these cards as sort of signal flares of just like, oh, so the deck is intending to do some gnarly stuff now, is it? Which feels like a very suitable. That's a kind of signal flare that I find useful when someone says bracket 3. I'm like, oh, I know what to expect. Whereas when someone says bracket 2, and I'm like, cool, I don't have to worry about Expropriate. I found that to be pretty relieving. Yeah. It's like, cool, I don't have to worry about Jin-Gitaxias or Tefer's bracket. Like those fall into a similar space in my brain. So I found them to be kind of nice inclusions on the list in terms of what they informed you in a pregame discussion. So I would have kept probably more of those here. So a couple more cards are removed than I necessarily would have. That's kind of my immediate impression here. And based on some of the conversations that we've seen online, I think a lot of people are feeling the same way, particularly with regards to Deflecting Swat. That's one that I've seen the most chatter about so far.
One point I think I will make, and I think this is going to apply to you too, Joey. There's a big difference, I think, between us liking a card being removed from the game changer list and us thinking that card is going to be a problem when removed from the game changer list. I don't think very many of these cards make the game better having them off the game changer list. But simultaneously, I doubt most of these will be a problem having them off the game changer list. So, and we're mostly focusing here on what we think the impact of them are going to be. That doesn't mean we like them or want the cards off or think it's, but we think it's probably not going to be a problem.
Yeah. And I really like what you said about the Jin point of it being taken off of this list does not mean that we're necessarily super going to see it suddenly flooding a whole bunch of spaces in bracket 2. I have plenty of reanimator decks, and some of them will operate in that bracket 3 space, and I still don't want to play Jin-Gitaxias. Yeah. Some of them will operate more in that bracket 2 type of space, and even with this being removed, I'm super not going to do that. It's just not the type of game that I want to play, where Jin is making other people discard their hands and things like that. I really want to keep that as a pin in your mind, everyone out there. Dana's point there will lead to some of the end game discussion that we've got about what these changes and what the brackets so far have revealed about Commander, because I think you hit on something very, very important there that will flesh out a little bit more at the end of the episode. We have more updates to cover as well. And of course, Dana, we got some shout outs to do before we continue on with all of this brand new news. So let's get to those real quick.
We are excited to be teamed up with Dragon Shield. MagicCon Atlanta a few weeks back marked the release of Dragon Shield's first licensed Magic the Gathering product, starting with some MagicCon Atlanta exclusive Draco Genesis sleeves from Tarkir Dragonstorm. And we got to see sleeves featuring EDHREC's most popular commander, the Ur-Dragon, as well as arts of each of these shocklands from Dragonstorm. And coming in 2026, we'll get sleeves for the Ravnica guilds as well. Just use the promo code EDHREC in all lowercase at dragonshield.com to get 5% off your next purchase. It helps the show and it helps your cards stay safe.
Once again, that's code EDHREC, all lowercase, for a discount on your Dragon Shield sleeves. This show is also brought to you by our patrons over at patreon.com/EDHRECast. And y'all, this show could not happen without you. And to show our thanks, we have great perks over there on Patreon, including access to our Discord, where you can chat with us about all of these changes in the format, or maybe find a game with some other players, or even access our Challenge the Stats spreadsheet that shows all of our Challenge the Stats over the past years. Plus, we have some exclusive content over there too, such as some deck text going over some of our favorite or signature decks. I just recorded one about my Commander deck, and it was a whole lot of fun. And of course, if you want to support us in totally free ways, you can do that too. Hit those like buttons, subscribe to see even more cool data, and also leaving a podcast review is huge. That matters a whole lot. And one final thing, in every episode, we like to shout out one of our fantastic patrons. So this week, give it up for Eric Blomain. Eric, cheers to you. Thank you for being a patron. You make this show possible.
Absolutely.
Last thing, if you happen to be in Tacoma for the Command Fest on Halloween weekend, hit me up. I'll be there with other creators like Olivia Gobert-Hicks, cosplayers, great artists. The event coordinator, Laughing Dragon, puts on a great time. So I'm really looking forward to that on Halloween weekend. I hope to see some of y'all there. Now, Dana, to get back to our topic, they didn't just lop off some game changers in this announcement. They also added some extra definition to the bracket system as well, throwing that image back on screen here. This includes some clarifying language in each section, more on that in a moment, but it especially includes a few overarching changes that are really worth noting and addressing, updating everyone about what that all is, so that we can build to our conclusions at the end of the show about what all of this has revealed about Commander and Commander players.
So there were a few important changes to some language that jumped out at us, and they talked about on the stream. And the first one I think that's maybe most relevant is this was on the graph they showed. It was the turns you're expecting the game to end.
Yes.
And this was a little bit surprising for me. I actually like having the signpost on there. I do find it very useful to tell what kind of experience people are looking for. I just was not expecting to see 6 showing up on the graphic for bracket 3.
Yeah, that was definitely a surprise. So to catch people up here, they gave some guidelines about length of games for each bracket to sort of estimate about how long that game can usually be anticipated to go before players start getting picked off in the game. So bracket 1, Exhibition, players can expect to play at least 9 turns before anyone wins or loses. Bracket 2, players can expect to play at least 8 turns before anyone wins or loses. Dana, as you just mentioned, at bracket 3, players can expect to play at least 6 turns before anyone wins or loses. At bracket 4, they say you can expect to play at least 4 turns before a win or loss. And at bracket 5, CEDH, games could end on any turn. So, CEDH, they already know what they're doing and they know what they're up to over here. But there have been some guidelines or expectations about the length of game for each of the brackets as well. This has invited plenty of discussion. So, Dana, let's discuss.
Yeah, this threw me a little bit. I like seeing these numbers on screen. I think it's very useful as a metric to determine what experience you're looking for, to know when you're thinking the games are going to end. I just didn't think. It seems like turn 4 is faster than I would have thought for bracket 4, and 6 seems faster than I would have thought to see for bracket 3.
Yeah. So this, I'm not going to lie, seeing the addition of an expected quote, safe turns. That's a very rudimentary, very boiling it down a little bit too basic of a way to say it, but seeing them put turn expectations on there, that to me feels like one of the biggest wins, but it does come with a couple of asterisks. So the at least end turns feels great to me because it's what I wanted from the start before they even announced the first bracket system, because it feels to me as though one of the primary causes of frustration that can come from casual Commander games is the gulf between how many turns you thought you were going to get, the turns that you expected to have, and when things are actually over. You know, not just that you didn't, quote, do the thing, but if it ends before you even reasonably felt like your deck would have had the ability to do anything. That mismatch is one of the bigger problems with why expectations are good to be set before the game even begins. Like, as a case in point to that, intuitively, I feel like everyone understands there's a big difference between comboing out on turn 5 and comboing out on turn 12. Like, in some cases, if the game has been going super long, you're almost begging for a combo to come around the corner so that the game can finally end, right? Speed is one of the primary reasons that we will feel different ways about whether a game was satisfying. So I wanted to see that reflected or expressed in the tools that we are trying to provide to players. Yeah. So I'm happy to see those types of guidelines, but it does mean like they're throwing a couple of players for a loop. I think, unfortunately, one of my asterisks on this too is that I think some of the language ends up being a little bit muddy, or it could give... It's deeply open to misinterpretation is one of my concerns with this a little bit right now.
Yeah. For starters, the way it's worded, and this is like right on the graph that we got from Wizards. How many turns you expect to play isn't necessarily the same thing as how many turns you expect, or when you have the game to end as well, right?
Right.
So like it says turn 6. Well, that means you should expect to play through 6 complete turns probably before you start. So that kind of means turn 7.
Yes. Yeah, that's like that is a huge. I'm seeing a lot of people reading these updates as like, oh, so bracket 3 games end on turn 6. That is not what this says. But I totally see why players are misinterpreting that way.
And that's how I read it at first.
Which I think is totally fair. I think it is not communicated as clearly as it perhaps could have been. It does make sense in my head that like, yeah, turn 7 is actually, I think, where we can probably see a lot of bracket 3 games begin to end. And we even have some data to kind of indicate some support on this as well. But it is currently, as worded, I think a little bit unclear for a lot of folks out there. In fact, it's a little bit unclear to this very image.
Sure.
Because further down in that bracket 3 area, it says that you should not expect any 2-card combos before turn 6 in bracket 3 space. But not before turn 6 means on turn 6. Whereas to play at least 6 turns before anyone wins or loses means people will start winning or losing on turn 7. Those are two different things. Those two phrases are not the same thing. So even this image, unfortunately, feels a little bit unclear to me, and that's a little bit unfortunate. So while I am celebrating seeing some turn length guidelines here, it does still unfortunately come with a couple of asterisks that I feel like I have to make comment on, because I'm a little bit like, dang, you were almost there.
Yeah, completely agree. And sometimes things happen, like someone gets the nut draw, the perfect combination of things, even if playing a combo, like the perfect combination of cards that lets them push for a win very quickly. That kind of thing is going to happen. My concern is this wording is going to make people be like, oh, I need to begin aiming to try to win games on turn 6 or turn 7.
Right.
Versus like that being acceptable.
Yeah.
And I think those are also very different things. Now, do I think players are going to do that? Probably not. But I also don't love that it's open for that level of interpretation.
Also, like, this does assume players are playing sensibly, not like, all right, cool, with my Necropotence here, I'm going to pay 35 life, and I should still expect to be safe for the next however many turns. No, that's a risk that you took. Like,
sure,
if I have the opportunity to mess with you and knock you out on turn 5 because you paid that much life irresponsibly, I will take it. You are not safeguarded by what this graph says. Like, this still does assume some amount of sensibility amongst players there.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think a lot of people will feel exactly the way that you felt, where it's like turn 6 seems fast, or at least 6 turns. Again, like it reads as though game ends on turn 6, unfortunately, on the image, but it does mean people start winning or losing on turn 7. I think a lot of people will feel that way. However, I want to refer to some data that we've done in previous episodes. Dana, you and I track our games, and we've done a couple of episodes about that on this channel, looking over our game data, decks that win a whole lot. And also one of the things that I've been measuring is at what turn does a player get knocked out, and at what turn does a game on average end. And through that data, I want to throw some numbers here on screen. I noticed that in 2023, games tended to end around turn 9, and that also held true for 2024, and that the first KO in a game tended to occur around turn 8, you could say.
Yep.
Now, bear in mind, I'm more often operating within the bracket 2 and bracket 3 space, so that definitely biases these numbers. As clarity here, this figure counts turns from my perspective, since I was measuring the efficacy of my own decks for other data purposes that we go over in those episodes. So basically, when I'm saying on turn 8 or so, that doesn't mean 8 full rounds of play. It means 8 of my own turns, and depending on the seeding order, that might not include everyone. So you could technically knock off like 0.5 from each of these numbers if you wanted to better represent a bird's eye view of the entire table.
Sure.
In other words, just because I saw 8 turns doesn't mean that everyone at the table saw 8 turns. So do keep that in mind with my numbers. This figure could be a little bit deceptive to the naked eye. If you want to hear a little bit more about how exactly those figures were calculated, definitely check those episodes out. They were a whole lot of fun. I have actually taken on the practice of like asking people occasionally at games tours or at events and things like that around what turn they think the game ended. And Dana, every single time, players overestimate how many turns the game actually went. When you play a 90-minute game, it might feel like the game ended on turn 10, but honestly, it was usually only like turn 8 or sometimes turn 7.
Sure.
Players think that games go to like turn 10 a lot of the time, but the games really don't. Even precons don't always make it there. A long game time-wise is not the same thing as a long game turn-wise. And that is, I think, a really important thing for us to keep in mind when we're looking at these numbers. But I think it will feel a little bit too fast still for a while for a lot of folks.
Yeah, definitely. Because I have not done my math on my numbers yet this year either, and we'll get to that here probably in not too many weeks when we do our kind of wrap up of our stats. But like just glancing at mine, and I did that earlier today after I saw these numbers. Like I'm gonna guess on average, games wrap up turn 8 or somewhere in there. The ones that I'm gonna play this year, once all said and done, between 8 and 9, somewhere in there. But that also doesn't mean someone didn't shoot a shot at, turn 7 either, right? Like just because that's when games tend to end, that doesn't mean someone didn't attempt to end them sooner and was unable to succeed.
Yeah.
And that's not, this is also saying that, right? It's not saying like games will end. It's just saying it's okay if someone takes that shot at that point in the game, succeed or not.
Yeah. Yeah, that is, again, unfortunately, some of the possible room for misinterpretation that this language unfortunately invites into the conversation.
Yeah.
And I do want to clarify that, like, a thing I'm really looking forward to in our 2025 edition of We Tracked All of Our Games, and here's all of the data. I'm going to, of course, be breaking down the games now by what bracket they were as well to try and see the length of games, the turn length by bracket. Those systems didn't exist in 2024 and in 2023, so we couldn't really measure it necessarily there. But here for this year, I'm very interested to see what the different game length ends up being and whether that lines up with what has now been proposed here with this new brackets image and this new understanding of core and upgraded bracket 2 and bracket 3. But even just, I'm literally just manually reading through the journal that I track all of my games in right here. I'm looking through some of the games that I have physically labeled as bracket 3, and I am noting, a person died on turn 7, or we got crater hoofed on turn 7, or here's a game where someone got knocked out on turn 8, and things like that. I am noticing several of those that feel like, okay, it's probably lining up there. These games that I know for sure everyone was playing a bracket 3 deck because we all announced it. The turn 7 expectation does feel accurate, at least to my cursory glance at some of the data I've been collecting. So that's a thing that I wanted to mention here. I think a lot of people will see that, like, I don't know, this figure looks a little bit fast, but I do think players have a habit of accidentally overestimating how many turns a game actually goes in Commander.
I think it's jarring to see, and in reality, it's probably not as far off the mark as it looks like when you first see it.
Yeah. But players are not wrong to feel as though it looks fast, because our sensation of like what makes for a satisfying game, turn length is not the only ingredient in that. I'm happy to see it is now part of the conversation, that it invites that conversation for the purposes of brackets and like finding a good game with other people. And it feels like a really important thing to set the expectation about, which is what this whole communication tool is supposed to be for in the first place. So I'm happy about it, but that doesn't mean that I think they landed it perfectly. I unfortunately think that there are a few things that were not as clear as perhaps they hoped that it would be upon this announcement. Now, that said, there is a detail here that I don't want to get too far into the episode without mentioning, that I think they really nailed in terms of the clarity that it helps to provide to the system and to help inform players about what each of these brackets actually are. So huge kudos to Rachel Weeks for putting this together. So the thing I want to draw attention to is these arrows adorned at the top that specify the primary difference between each bracket. So for instance, it says the difference between brackets 2 and 1 is theme. Bracket 1 goes hard on theme, like to a fault. Whereas the difference between bracket 2 and 3 is staples. The difference between bracket 3 and 4 is speed. The difference between bracket 4 and 5 is the metagame. Quick, punchy, easy taglines that clarify a very common question people will have about what it is that really makes each of these areas actually feel different from each other. I really appreciate this simple, easy clarification. It's one of my favorite details here. That part in particular deserves a whole lot of praise.
There was one more particularly relevant language change here, and that's regarding tutors.
Yes.
Previously, in bracket 2, there was a line about few tutors.
Yeah.
And that's been removed. And the logic given in large part was built around the fact that, like, how do you define a tutor? A fetch land is technically a tutor to a degree. Like, nature's lore is a tutor. What qualifies as a tutor? Does that mean that in a bracket 2 deck you can't run Steel Shaper's Gift, or you can't run a Tezzeret that goes and gets you something, or is Urza's Cave a problem? Like, at what point, what is few and what is a tutor, right? I do get that logic. This, however, does open up the possibility in bracket 2 to run a whole bunch of tutors now in a way that you maybe couldn't do before. Granted, they're not going to be of the vampiric tutor, demonic tutor level efficiency, but like there's a lot. Not everything is a 5-mana tutor either. Like, just because it's not demonic tutor doesn't mean it's diabolic tutor either, right? There's still plenty of good things you can run in that space.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on this one, Joey?
So I understand and you made exactly this point already, so I am just kind of repeating you a bit here, but I think when this was all first announced, a lot of the folks involved in the panel and at Wizards of the Coast saw like that a couple of tutors had been named, the big ones that are already on the Game Changers list, the Vampiric Tutor, the Enlightened Tutor, all of those. A lot of them were named outright, but then there also was a qualification for few tutors. And having both of those things felt a little bit strange and probably felt like it was opening the doors for misinterpretation in that way. Because it's like, why are you saying both of these things? In the same way that Food Chain was just removed because it's known to be a combo engine piece, but combos are already dealt with in the bracket system on a totally different axis, or we don't need to put every MLD card onto the Game Changers list because that's already covered by the stuff that is described in bracket 4. I think that they felt that same issue happening here with tutors. They wanted to provide some clarity there by removing it, and hopefully taking away the description would make it more clear that they're talking about this type of thing specifically. That motivation for this move on this announcement makes a lot of sense to me. But from what I've heard from you so far, in some of our discussions, even before we started recording here, it unfortunately feels like to you, maybe it didn't have that intended effective clarity and it actually muddied things up a little bit more. Or it seems like this is a move that you had the most concerns about when this was announced.
Yeah, so my concern is always enabling people to do a well, actually, and like, well, technically. I remember back when in high school, I had friends that were like amateur wrestlers, high school wrestling, and weight class is very important in high school. And you want to be at the exact maximum you can be in that weight class. So like those guys I remember would carry on water bottles during the day and like spit in the water bottle so they could cut weight and get to exactly that cutoff limit. And I always want to make sure that's not a thing that we're doing in EDH where people are like, well, technically it's a bracket 2 deck and I can run these 8 different tutors to get out like my combo piece and not be violating any rules. But it doesn't seem like the community does a lot of that anymore. That was a thing that I think people did once upon a time. And I feel like on the whole, we've moved away from doing that. So while I don't necessarily love opening up the option to, well, actually, regarding how many tutors you're running, I don't know if people are really doing that anyway, like, or at least as much as they once did. I think the bracket system has made it more difficult for people to hide behind kind of the plausible deniability. And my guess is, while I don't necessarily love this change, it's probably not going to be that impactful.
Yeah, a very fair point. I think that this helps put into focus, for me at least, that not all tutors are created equal, which I think was understood from the very first announcements. But like you mentioned Steel Shaper's Gift and stuff like that. Equipment tutors can be very optimal. That's a 1-mana Steel Shaper's Gift. Go and find any equipment. But even the strategy, the game plan of equipment where you still have to play and attach and then attack, that's a very different thing to a Vampiric tutor finding you exactly what you need, or the other available stuff. Like those are different types of tutors, even if they are 1-mana. And even the idea of like this inviting more potential, quote, hidden commanders within the bracket 2 space. I've got this other legend or this other non-legendary card that's in my deck that is actually the real theme of the entire deck. And I'm going to use a couple of janky things to just go and find them so that I can actually have, and I need probably a decent density of those to find whatever this is going to be, so that I can have a deck build around that. Like, it does feel like it creates that invitation back in that bracket 2 area. And I'm happy to see that. But I also understand, if I'm understanding your concern correctly, it is inviting a little bit more, I guess, genericism into the bracket 2 space as well, if that becomes more of a habit. And I hope that you're right, that it doesn't become more of a habit.
Yes, it's one of those things where, like, in theory, it can cause more homogenization. But
Yeah,
I don't. But that's been true of a lot of the changes they've made so far, and they haven't panned out to. They haven't. It hasn't worked that way. So just because something could do something doesn't mean it will, and it seems like it hasn't been going that direction. And that's a great point about hidden commanders as well. We talked about this on the live stream we did right after the changes went out. I have a Helix Pinnacle deck, for example, and in order to get Helix Pinnacle consistently in that deck, I just had to have like half a dozen tutors in the list. Which at that point put me beyond, I felt, put me beyond the few tutors standard. Therefore, It's a bracket 3 deck. And then I'm like, well, since it's a bracket 3 deck, I might as well put Demonic and Vampiric in here instead of running like ones that are more expensive. It didn't make a difference, though. Like, that deck is just not necessarily good enough to play in bracket 3, but I didn't really
have with Helix Pinnacle, yeah.
But
It's a weird strategy.
Have a choice. Whereas, like, now I will have the option to, like, drop that back to a bracket 2 where it's more appropriate, swap that Vamp tutor out and that Demonic tutor out for worse tutors, but be able to play in a space where the deck's probably actually has a chance to close out a game versus, it takes me 6 turns to even have Helix Pinnacle and stuff on board before I can begin putting mana into it, let alone be able to actually have a chance to succeed. So yeah, while I don't love it, it also does open up some play for people to have chances to do things like hidden commanders that maybe weren't an option before in bracket 2.
Yeah. I think an interesting point that I want to put into the conversation here, though, it was interesting. We just had our SALT updates very recently, and I'm going to throw some data at y'all. When we looked at the game changers in the SALT data, and we looked at how they ranked amongst each other, which ones were highest at the top and which ones were lowest, we actually did notice that there were several tutors at the bottom of the list in terms of their SALT score, which is not the end-all be-all by anything, but it is just curious to compare, Gamble and Crop Rotation specifically were the two at the bottom of the list in terms of the SALT scores that they incurred. On a scale of 0 to 4, Gamble scored a 0.75 and Crop Rotation scored a 0.92. And actually the bottom of the list has several of the other tutors there as well, from Worldly Tutor to Mystical Tutor to even Imperial Seal. That is something that I did want to throw in there. The perception of tutors is a little bit of a finicky thing in some cases. So I wanted to give some folks some extra context there in case they find it useful. And this actually is kind of interesting, given that a lot of the discussion that I saw online, I think a lot of players expected a card like Gamble or even Crop Rotation to be removed from the list compared to the other stuff that was removed. So it's interesting to see the community perception and then the SALT scores, but then also see that those things still remained on the Game Changer list through these updates.
Yeah, it is interesting to see the community's thoughts about the things versus like what the rules committee thoughts is versus for a lot of this stuff. Crop rotation is a good example. And that's one like we ourselves as a podcast are split on. Matt and I have made the point that we feel like it's probably pretty safe because most of the cards that one would go get with a crop rotation are already game changers. So like you're probably playing in a space bracket 4 or something where you're able to go get those. You don't necessarily share that thoughts. Like even you don't agree necessarily on how safe crop rotation might be.
Yeah, like I definitely understand folks' arguments for why something like Gamble feels a lot different. Like it feels of a different ilk to the Vampiric Tutor and stuff like that. Gamble actually makes the most sense to me as like if I were to remove one of these, Gamble would be it. Crop rotation, the point specifically of like it mostly finds other game changers, I'm not necessarily feeling that way. Even I believe I've seen you use it to go and find a Talon Gates of Madara to phase a creature out to protect it, for instance, which is a cool little move. And the more of those lands that they create in the format, the more that crop rotation is going to get better and better. Frankly, I've even been crop rotationed into a surprise Bajuka Bog when I was trying to do a cool move. I'm like, dang, that card is flexible. So you know what? Maybe because of that, I'm just super biased. But the point is, it's something that I still have my eye on as deceptively powerful, and that it isn't just the way that it can find other game changers so much as its continued potential for growth is something that I have my eye on. But it also still doesn't surprise me, despite all of those opinions. It does not surprise me to see it near the bottom of the list because of that potential for deception and because of the other things that can feel a lot more game warping that are already on the game changers list. So just something that I wanted to throw in there. I think a lot of people maybe had their eyes on those as potential removals, and we see that reflected in the SALT data. That is sort of where player sentiment was. I guess with this discussion on tutors, I think I had wanted to either see that they would provide some clarity of the language around like what means few tutors, or that they would like expand or define the list of tutors that are there. Or I think the direction I was hoping to go was that they remove tutors from the game changers list and lean a lot more into what does quote few tutors mean. But they went the opposite direction, and that's fine. But it's just not what I personally expected to have happen. So I'll have to adjust a couple of my expectations from there,
Yeah, this was not a change that I foresaw coming. The changing of the tutors system, particularly because, like we talked about with the commanders, they're going to add a new VV every year, or two new
Yes.
VVs, or three, meaning a card at that power level in the command zone. They're not adding new vampiric, demonic, enlightened level tutors. We haven't seen any tutor of that power level in a really, really long time. So that's not a problem that's really like changing, or the game needs to adjust for additional cards like that in a way that it does for commanders. So yeah, this was one I was kind of surprised at.
Yeah. This does kind of beg the question, actually, now, since we've been talking about things that maybe people thought would come off. And indeed, the announcement here did mention a couple of cards that apparently were discussed very heavily within the Commander Format panel and on the rules committee about other game changers that could have come off the list but did actually stay. They provided some clarifying language about Panoptic Mirror, about Coalition Victory, and about Consecrated Sphinx, which I guess are near the bottom of the list for them, cards that could potentially come off the game changer list in the future. Are there any of the other game changers that maybe you, before the announcement, expected to be removed from this list that have actually stayed? And how do you feel about that?
I had expected to see actually possibly crop rotation for the reasons I mentioned.
Okay.
And actually Consecrated Sphinx was one as well.
Yeah, same.
I thought that might come off the list.
Big same.
It's 6 mana. It's not a reanimation target like you see with Jin-Gitaxias necessarily. It felt relatively safe. Not that it isn't like a super strong card, but and it's just not one like even right now you really necessarily see a ton of in bracket 3 or bracket 4 decks, just because there's better things taking up those slots, particularly in bracket 3. I do, however, wonder if their logic isn't, oh, this is the kind of card that people would love to jam into a bracket 2 deck.
Yeah.
So that might be the thought process there.
Yeah, for me, I feel like Sphinx feels exactly like the type of exciting card that I want players to put into an upbeat precon in some ways. And for the most part, there are some other cards that I look at, like a Constant Mists or a Mana Drain, which I think I've mentioned in past episodes covering developments like these.
Yeah.
Where I look a little askance. I'm like, do I really expect a person who's playing at bracket 2, a person whose deck wins in ways that are incremental, to play around these cards? I don't know. These feel exactly like the kinds of cards that benefit from a pregame heads up.
Yeah.
Whereas I don't think that Consecrated Sphinx is a card that benefits from a pregame heads up. I feel like if it comes down midway through the game, I think that feels excitingly powerful more often than it feels frustratingly powerful, which is how I feel some of the other cards can come off when they come out of nowhere.
Sure.
I look at those and I'm like, you know that calling this deck a 2 is probably a little bit gauche if you're playing those, right? Like I get more of those reactions from some of those types of spells compared to what a Consecrated Sphinx does to the game and at the stage that it does it to a game. But, you know, if it stays on, so it goes. But Sphinx is the kind of thing that, like, if Jin was going to go off, I would have expected Sphinx to be removed too.
And to continue on the point with those, particularly Jin-Gitaxias and Sphinx, for the next 12 months. So, if we were have to have a reconvening of this conversation next, Halloween-ish, I would wager, despite not being a game changer, I haven't seen any Jin-Gitaxias show up in games. And despite being a game changer, I still have seen a couple of Consecrated Sphinxes. My guess is that's the logic. Like Jin-Gitaxias isn't going to suddenly start showing up in decks despite not being a game changer. Sphinx already is seeing some amount of play, and it would probably see more in a way that Jin-Gitaxias won't in particularly bracket 2 were it legal. So that's my guess of the thought process and why it wouldn't be taken off, but I also don't think it would be a problem necessarily.
That's a really fair point. You've mentioned before some of the cards that have been unbanned in the past and cards that don't get unbanned. There is sort of a, will players have self-control about this type of thing is a metric you've used before. So it's, I'm happy to understand more about like where you're coming from with these attitudes. So that's a really good point to bring up about some of these. I think to real quick sort of answer my own question about like other things that I expected to be discussed, Field of the Dead not being mentioned in the article about potential things that might have been near the bottom of the list or could have been removed. That one felt a little bit, like, I think I expected to see something about that one. Field of the Dead being the land that if you have 7 different land names, then each land that you play is going to produce a zombie for you. Field of the Dead's a fantastic card, and to be honest, just the fact that it is one of the representations of landfall on the list is pretty nice to see. I'm generally pretty cool with this being sort of a signal that, like, if your deck is able to use Field of the Dead very well, then that probably indicates something about the rest of your deck and how it's constructed. So this is a good signal flare of what the rest of your deck can do generally. So I'm very fine with it being a game changer. But I think compared to the rest of the cards that are on the game changer list, I expected to see some discussion about this and was surprised that there wasn't discussion about it. So I'm happy for it to stay, but it would have been near the bottom of my own personal list, is I think what I'm just trying to communicate there.
I would tend to agree with that. The reason I say that is because if someone drops Field of the Dead, even in a deck where like they are able to like, oh, I know next turn it's going to start making a zombie or 2 zombies, I can survive someone making a couple zombies every single turn for several turns. And there are a lot of cards on that game changer list where I can't survive. Like, you will lose the game if that card is in play for several turns. And that isn't necessarily the case of Field of the Dead. Most of the time it's not the case of Field of the Dead. That's like it would be unusual for that to be a card that's going to kill you if it sits in play for, say 2 turns. Mm-hmm. And that's just not true with most of those game changer cards. So yeah, that logic is why I find it to be relatively safe as well.
Yeah. But I again do appreciate that one of the things that the bracket system or that game changer sort of invite is, again, those signal flare type of things. Like these are a little bit of a signpost that indicates the thought and the care and the therefore intention that went into the rest of the deck's construction. So if one of these cards does sort of indicate like, hey, let's be real. If your mana base is good enough for this to start doing some stuff that we know it's capable of, you're probably not playing it too. Like, that feels fair. And I do appreciate some of the cards on the game changer list being those types of signposts. But that, of course, makes me look back at some of the cards that were removed, and I'm just like, but isn't that a signpost too? And so, like, it's just kind of funny to see some of these updates. But in general, I'm still pretty happy here. I think a way that the three of us characterized our reaction to this was that it feels a little bit like a lateral move for a whole lot of these changes, rather than a definite 100% we're way on board improvement, or rather than like, oh, they took a step in the complete wrong direction. For the most part, we feel as though there's been sort of a side shift for most of this. We're readjusting our expectations, but it doesn't feel like we think that the ship has gone in a perfect direction, nor has it gone in a bad direction. Seems to be our main tone from when we first saw these.
Yeah, and even the things that I didn't necessarily like aren't things that I'm worried about. I think they just will not be problems, despite me not liking them. So yeah, no, I think this is a change, and I do think like the ability to have people play hidden commander decks is a general net positive. So there are some advantages that I think long term will probably be good as well.
Mm-hmm. This does kind of beg the question. We talked about some stuff that we maybe thought could have come off or expected to see discussion about. Were there any game changer-esque cards that you, before this announcement, maybe expected to be added to the list that, of course, were not added to the list?
I was expecting to see VV added, and they went the other opposite direction, but like
very much, yeah.
We've kind of talked ourselves into the logic behind that. They just can't keep adding all of these, so that makes sense. I was kind of expecting Trouble in Pairs to show up on there.
To go back?
Go back, yeah. And for the same reason you mentioned, like, it feels wrong to see a mana drain in bracket 2 or something. It feels sketchy to me. Like, I have a couple of Troubles in Pairs that I got when they were, early on before it was super expensive. I have them in a couple decks, and I always feel like I'm doing something that's like it's very much Trouble in Pairs when I play it. I feel a little bit like I'm doing something that I shouldn't be doing. So that's my that card feels weird in bracket 2, and I was expecting that might go back on. But in talking about it, Matt made the good point that sometimes colors are allowed to have just really strong things that aren't game changers. Blue gets Mystic Remora. Maybe this is White's version of that. White has, generally speaking, less really powerful cards that are game changers. Yeah. Maybe this is one of the ones White gets to kind of get away with. And I actually kind of buy that logic.
All right, cool. I understand that. I think, I said it before, I believe, but I'll say it again here. Something like a mana drain are the kind of cards that I have my eyes on. I was like, you sure that belongs in bracket 2? is kind of my thing. And here we are trying to put rules and exact specifications onto what mostly boils down to vibes. So there are a few that I still would have had my eyes on. I possibly even could have bet that they might have added a small number of things to the list rather than removing the 10 that they did. But just kind of an interesting thing there. Like we said, though, overall it does feel sort of like a lateral move, and us finding exact unifying, everyone 100% agrees universally here on what definitely belongs on the list or not. It's always going to be a little bit hard to achieve the universal praise there. So we're all going to have those different proclivities of about what we think should or should not have, quote unquote. This does kind of bring us to one final thing here, though, Dana. We've mentioned a lot of what the news is and our personal feelings about a whole lot of it, but I want to return to that pin that we put. We put a pin in a piece of the conversation earlier, and I want to return to that. And it came up when you were discussing Jin Gitaxias about players' reaction to it. Jin Gitaxias being removed from Game Changer status does not necessarily mean that a whole lot of players will be suddenly flooding to go put it into their decks. And that feels true to me. That felt true to me when you said it. And that's where I think we get around to, the title of this episode, what the brackets reveal about Commander, about the format, about players. And I think a really big ingredient in what the future of the game is going to look like lies in your observation there about player behavior and responses in deck building to these changes that we've just seen.
Yeah, I think one of two things has happened. Either the player base has gotten better at self-control regarding what cards they play in what spaces, or the brackets have made it difficult for folks to have kind of plausible deniability about the things they're doing that might be inappropriate. Maybe it's a combination of those two things. I'm not sure. But once upon a time, I would have been I definitely have gotten hit by an entombed, reanimated Jin Gitaxias over the years in places that didn't feel appropriate. And that hasn't happened in some amount of time, whether it's because, like you said, players have learned that kind of self-control and aren't looking to do those kind of things in games where it isn't appropriate anymore, or the brackets system made it tougher. That's not the kind of expectation you have in bracket 2, or whatever that combination of things is. I think the player base has gotten much better at, for whatever reason, not doing things that aren't appropriate for the brackets they're in.
It does feel, a note that we made here is that potentially the angle shooters are getting tired.
Maybe, yeah.
That it does feel as though a good consequence of all of these discussions, hard as it can be to find exact rules and specifications to put onto talk with people, to put onto how to navigate a conversation and to just find a game that everyone kind of vibes with, hard as that can be, it does feel as though a lot of these tools have given... This communication tool has given players more ability to kind of notice a thing that they weren't vibing with and why that is the case, and then get a little bit better at hopefully avoiding that in the future, to the point that the folks who are doing that angle shooty thing that you mentioned are kind of like, what's the point of me trying to keep up with this then necessarily? Right. I might be communicating this a little bit poorly, but it does seem as though, I don't expect a whole lot of people to go out and running, this has been delisted, so I can put it into bracket 2 and everyone's going to have to be happy about it, and I'll get to actually or something like that. I don't sense that as the response from people here. And that's nice to see. That's really good to see, because that's not the attitude that I enjoy about gaming with people. And it does seem, if nothing else, that we've all gotten a little bit better of understanding this is about vibes. Find people who you really vibe with. Make sure that this all feels like everyone's really super on board. And that's a win. Yeah. That really is kind of a win.
The logic of if you don't want to play against Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy in bracket 2, you can just opt out of that game because you'll see it in the command zone. That holds true. But I also feel like no one's going to try to do that for the most part. I'm not going to have a situation where someone sits down and is like, technically Kinnan's legal now. There's not a game changer, so I can run it in this bracket 2 deck. People just aren't probably, for the most part, going to be doing that. And so I think the community has just, like I said, gotten better at controlling themselves for whatever reason. And it's made a lot of stuff safe.
And we see that with other commanders, like a Voya, for instance. I mean, Voya's cracked. The commander's absolutely ridiculous. Yeah. And I think that, if nothing else, even if it isn't just about the angle shooters, but actually about the players themselves who are playing against those potential types of, quote, bracket 2 Kinnan decks, they have more abilities to point to why it is that this might cause some consternation or be the kind of thing that they don't want to have a game about. And I think that more players would be capable of looking at a Voya and being like, I don't trust that that's going to give me the thing that I was hoping to get from this game just because you said it has no game changers in it. I see a little bit less of that thing where people are saying technically it's a 2. I don't see that quite as much. And it seems like people are eventually correcting their understanding. Just because it doesn't have a game changer means it's definitely a 2. It having no game changers means it qualifies to be a bracket 2. And players seem to be... I don't think that we've gotten there. I don't think this is like definitely we're already super there the case, but I do feel like we are getting there. We are moving more incrementally in that direction, and it is stuff like this that has given players more tools to be able to identify those things and then to communicate those things, and that does feel nice to see. That is a nice thing for these brackets to have revealed about our relationship to the game, and the fact that people aren't going to just rush out to suddenly. I don't think we're going to see a surge of Jin-Gitaxias and decks. I just don't, and that's good. Yay, less angle shooting, you know. So
we would have once upon a time, 10 years ago, 12 years ago, had Panoptic Mirror been legal, you would have seen a lot of people putting time warps on Panoptic Mirrors.
Right.
Like that was something you would have encountered a lot of times in the wild, even, when you were trying to play a lower power game. That's been legal now. That card was banned. It's now a game changer. It's been available for people to put a time warp on it. And it's not a problem because like people just aren't looking for ways to kind of actually these cards the way they once were, at least maybe 6, 8, 10 years ago. Yeah,
I mean, Panoptic Mirror was also near the bottom of the salt scores.
Yeah,
and it's now showing up in 4,500 decks ish. Coalition Victory is showing up in about 5,000-ish. Those cards were unbanned, and we did not see huge surges of players rushing to take advantage of these types of things. So I think another thing that the brackets and that these changes have revealed is that the format does move pretty darn slowly. This is not the kind of thing that players are suddenly rushing to fill a void. This is the kind of thing that it seems like players are very happy to be where they're at, and are looking for tools to help them communicate more where they're at, rather than trying to find ways to get one over on each other. And that's refreshing. That's a nice thing to see that this whole system has been able to cast that into a good light on players,
Very much so. I think it reflects well on the community as a whole as well.
I do think that it also does kind of reveal, though, that as a community, we require some simplicity and definitely a whole lot of clarity. We spent a good chunk of the earlier part of this episode talking about people are going to misinterpret the at least 6 turns thing. People just are, because I don't think that it is communicated as clearly as it could have been. But we are Magic players. We are very used to Magic's rule system and definite clarity of language.
Yeah.
So we are hyper conscious of muddy language at all times. Like, Dana, have you had the experience where you're playing any other board game, and because you're so used to the way that Magic does its stuff with the stack, when you're trying to figure out how something works in another board game, you end up with the least intuitive version of what the conclusion is probably supposed to be, compared to everyone else at the table being like, I don't think it works that way. But it's because you're stuck in that Magic mindset. This happens to me all the time, dude.
The one I've run into multiple times is may. You may do this, and like most other games, may just means you're definitely doing that thing.
Yeah. So we as Magic players very clearly need a lot of hyper clarity in our stuff. But the more clarity that you provide, sometimes it feels like you're being too strict with the rules. So that's a very difficult balance for the folks who are in charge of all of these announcements. But I think that is something that this recent announcement has also revealed about us. We need that clarity, but we also need, in some ways, a little bit of relative simplicity. Players have really latched on to the ability to name just a number and let that number do a lot of the talking for them. But that does mean that the stuff that goes into that number does need to make sure that it doesn't have something that could confuse people or accidentally set the expectation that the game is going to end on turn 6, which unfortunately it feels like parts of this announcement might accidentally indicate, even though that is not the case. So I hope that us talking about it is able to dispel some of that potential misinterpretation in some way.
Yeah, definitely. I think so. Like just having this conversation with you, has made me feel better about these changes. Like just us talking about it out loud with ourselves has clarified some things for me and made me feel a little more comfortable with it.
Mm. I can't help but wonder one last thing about whether this has revealed something about players. Do you think that what we've seen here kind of also reveals that a lot of players are afraid to call themselves a bracket 2, or perhaps that ego is making them want to say that things are a bracket 3? I'm kind of curious where you land on that. I feel as personally, I guess to sort of state my case about why this is in my head, I feel like a lot of the conversation that I've seen around this system and around this most recent announcement as well, a lot of people sort of discount bracket 1 because it is more or less the meme, the exhibition, you're doing something deeply silly. But then people sort of had this instinct of well, I don't want to say I'm just a 2 because it feels as though 2 is, quote, a bad thing. And I don't think it is a bad thing, but I think it could be perceived as quote, bottom of the barrel. Do you feel as though any of these have led or reinforced that potential problem in players or not? I'm trying to make up my mind about whether that is something that we're seeing based off of all the conversation about this announcement. And
I've never gotten that vibe from people where they're like, oh, I don't want to call my deck a 2. I'm going to call it, say it's a 3 because I don't, want to feel bad about my brewing or what I put together. much more confusing, or what's been more of a problem with that bracket 2, bracket 3 line is the people that are either like, well, there's no game changers, therefore it must be a bracket 2.
Yeah.
Where they're like not taking intent into account. Or I've run into the kind of the inverse of that a little bit too, where someone's like, well, this deck plays very strongly, plays as a strong 2, maybe too much, so I'm gonna play it in bracket 3. But they haven't made the appropriate maybe tweaks. Like just because it's too strong for a 2 doesn't necessarily mean it's a 3 either. At least until you make a couple tweaks. So I don't think that means there needs to be something in between 2 and 3. I just think there's a difference between a 2 and a 3, and you need to adjust your deck accordingly. Just because your deck is too strong for a 2 doesn't mean you're not going to struggle in 3 unless you make a few tweaks.
Interesting. Yeah, we've talked about that a little bit before, also off camera. So it's good to like bring it back up here. That hasn't entirely been my experience, but I do see what you mean about like it sort of forces the choice to be a little bit more obvious, the intention, as you said there. So that's a good thing to keep in mind. And I guess kind of circling back around to something that this could have potentially revealed about players, that angle shooty thing of a lot of people pretending that their deck is just a 2 because it doesn't have game changers. I think we saw some of that, and I'm sure there are still plenty of people out there who are still trying to do that. But it does feel as though there are fewer opportunities to do that because more players are able to kind of call out. It's just like, you see that happening, like, all right, sure, Jan. I feel like that is the direction that we're moving in. So that bracket 2 space does still have that nebulousness of like, it's an area for potential ankle shooting, but it's also an area where some people might feel ego could drive them out of that because they don't want to say they're, quote, just a 2. But I'm hoping that that is simmering or mellowing out in some ways. I hope that we see that reflected here with how people will respond to these changes. But it is something that still remains in the back of my mind, is I guess something I wanted to say. This has caused me to become more aware of those potentialities, and I hope that being aware of them means that I can keep better track of how it is that players are able to relate to each other in those ways. So definitely fascinating changes, to say the least. But Dana, I think that's about all the time that we have right now, because we got to go get ready for a wedding, man. Matt's about to get married, and we got to go travel. So I think we wrap it up here and call it good, and go get ready to watch some folks walk down the aisle. What do you say?
I'm all on board. I'm ready to do some dance and eat some wedding cake.
There you go. So listeners out there, let us know how you feel about all of these changes. That is the thing that we are interested in, is what all of these changes mean for the format and what it means for you out there in the way that you are able to have these conversations to find better and better games. Let us know all about it, because that's how we're going to find the best possible system for everyone to have the best possible time in this game. But with that, we got to call this episode to a close. So Dana, if our listeners want to get in touch with us to let us know all their thoughts about these new announcements, where is it that they can find you online, man?
You can find me online at Dana Roach. I write articles for EDHREC, and you can find all of us together at patreon.com/EDHRECast.
And you can find me everywhere online, from Instagram to Blue Sky, at Joseph M. Schultz. And you can find the cast online at EDHRECast. Listeners, we'll be back at you next week with more data and insights. But until then, remember, EDHREC your deck before you wreck your deck.